The Rangers were disarmed and marched to a nearby camp or compound, as they were told, to await the result of their protest. Of the conditions in that camp, let Joe Hall speak.
Well, we were under canvas in the month of July in the Punjab in India, in a jungle station, and several of our men, about 50 of our men, while we were there, was taken away with sunstroke.
On July 2nd, a major of the Rangers arrived at the camp with a subaltern and 30 men of the South Wales borderers. What followed was described to me by Tom Turney. The major read out the names of the ringleaders and asked them to step forward.
When asked what was the men to go out for, he said it was a fatigue party. But it looked very suspicious. It dawned on us straight away that it was the leaders that were kicking out. So we pulled them back. And every time they called a name and tried to get the man out, we beat them back, although we had nothing on our boots and hands. Now the armed forces was in front of us and all around us with loaded rifles, and they were ready for action, although I know in my heart that some of those men did not appreciate their position.
The major, I was told, had actually given the command 5 rounds standing load, preparatory to firing, when a Franciscan priest took his place by the men, determined to die with them. At that moment, Colonel Jackson, the staff officer mentioned before, rode up on horseback.
Men, he said, I'm sorry for what happened here today. He says, I was in no way responsible. He says, who is responsible for this? And the captain told him that it was our own second in command that ordered it. Well, then there was some unpleasantness between the commanding officer of the South Wales Borders and our own second in command. We were ordered back to the tents again without any further trouble. The next thing happened was that the doctor came, the men they were open for the heat. And we were in tents covered by canvas, and those insects was coming up through the sand. The doctor ordered us back immediately under solid cover.
The doctor was Captain Carney of the Royal Army Medical Corps, the battalion's M.O. Captain Carney's widow now lives in the suburbs of Dublin, and I talked with her beneath the case containing her husband's military cross and other decorations, his photograph as a brigadier and ADMS during the Second World War, and her son's photograph in the uniform of the Royal Air Force. Mrs. Carney was one of the few women in the station that hadn't gone to the hills, and as a young wife expecting a baby, she has vivid memories of what happened.
My husband came to the bungalow in great distress, and he said, the Connaughts have mutinied. I said, what does that mean? I was very young and I didn't know very much about these things. And he said, of course, it's a very serious thing because it means, of course, eventually there'll be no Connaughts and possibly no Irish regiments as we knew them.
But before then, immediately the mutiny broke out, Captain Carney had attempted to intervene.
And he went to the colonel and he said, may I have your permission to speak to these men? Because, just give me 1 hour. I brought some of their children into the world. I know their children by name, I know their wives, I know their families. And he said, I think they listen to me. Because it's a dreadful thing if this is allowed to go on. But of course the colonel's hands were tied. He couldn't give a captain who was in the RAMC permission to do this. We then went to visit the men in prison, and the conditions were dreadful. So he sent in his report about the men. No notice was taken of it. He sent in a second report, and still there's no notice taken of it. And in his third report, he put in a word that's not allowed in the army. He said that in his opinion as a medical officer, the treatment of the men was inhuman. He was asked to remove this word by his colonel. He said he would not. He'd stand by it, no matter what happened.
And eventually, as we've seen, Captain Carney's protests had effect, and the men were brought back to barracks. They were confined in one large bungalow, which was fenced around with barbed wire. There was no bedding for the men to sleep on. A few days after their return from the camp, troops from another regiment entered the bungalow. This is Tom Turney's account.
They carried entrenching toward handles as battens, and they dragged by force the leaders out. And they put them under close arrest in the guardroom right opposite us. We were then idling about, doing nothing, passing the time any way we could. About 2 days after, our second-in-command came in with some of our own officers into the compound, and he read a proclamation signed by the Viceroy of India, granting a free pardon to all the men in the compound if they fell in on their markers. They would then become loyal soldiers and there would be no disciplinary action taken against them. Well, there was a stampede and there was quite a lot of soldiers fell in and left a small bunch, a very small bunch, and there was gaps between a few that was left standing. My company quartermaster sergeant come over and he said, "Tierney, fall in with your company." I said, "Bring them in out the sovereign themselves and give them the same option as you're giving me. If they fall in, I fall in. What they're guilty of, I am." He put a snarl on his face and he says, "Is that so?" I said, "Yes." He turned around and he said to my friend, my pal, "What about you?" He said, "What he says goes for the two of us."
And now all but 48 of the mutineers had returned to duty. And that evening the 48 were taken manacled and leg-armed to Dagshy prison to await trial. The mutiny at Jalunda was over. They were soon joined by another party from Solon, where events had taken a more tragic turn. Of these I had an account from an officer of the regiment who was there.
We were having dinner in the mess on this particular evening, and we heard a sound outside of men marching. The mess waiter came up to Captain Badham, who was presiding at mess that night, and told him that a number of men were outside and wanted to talk to him. It was dark, but there was a light shining out from the mess windows, and we could see the company were drawn up in 2 lines facing the mess building, which was a hut. There was a man standing in front of the company, and this was Private Daly. Daly stepped forward and made a short statement in which he said that they had been informed in letters and other communications from home that the Black and Tans were treating their relatives and friends and people at home, parents, brothers and sisters, badly, terrorizing them, shooting them up, so on. And they wanted to protest against this treatment. He spoke well and in an orderly manner, and the whole thing was rather impressive, I thought. Captain Badham asked for a chair to be brought out from the mess. He stood up in the chair and he made a short address to the men. Then he called them to attention, and no man moved. He again did it. Again, there was no move from the drawn-up company. He then got down from the chair. Daly stepped forward, gave the command attention, right turn, quick march, and the company marched off under Daly in perfect order.
Private James Daly, in fact, showed himself during the Solon episode to be a born leader and inspirer of men. From all accounts, he was more politically conscious, as we'd say today, than most of the mutineers, being, as we've heard, an active sympathizer with Sinn Féin, the movement for Irish independence.
There was no further trouble that evening, or anything like that. Everything seemed to be quieting down. The next day, as far as I remember, we held a conference and we decided that it would be much safer if we could persuade the men to hand in their arms, which were in their barrack rooms in the Indian method, that is, in racks, which were locked, of course, to prevent theft. They agreed to do this, and the arms were duly brought into the magazine and locked up there. I can't very well remember what took place that day, except that there were no parades, but everything was very orderly. No disturbance of any sort. That evening, we heard a rumor, I forget now how it started, that they were preparing to try to recover their arms.
The rumor was correct. It seemed that another rumor had flown around the canteen that evening. I remember troops of other regiments were advancing and so on, and that the mutineers were likely to be shot out of hand. Jim and his comrades urged an attack on the magazines where the arms were stored. Faithful to the passive resistance policy Daly refused. What, are you afraid? Some of the others asked him. I'll show you if I'm afraid, he said. I'll lead the attack. One of the men who followed him was Tommy Devine of Connaught, who had been wounded at Mons and Ypres.
We had a naked bayonet, just a naked bayonet, that was all. Well, you see, the magazine is up on the hill like that, and we're down in a hollow like here. Well, the guard is up there, they're up on the hill. We have good cover down here. You understand? We started off anyway. Things went very well, we got about halfway. And they opened up with a volley on us. Of course, we took for cover. It was all right, the first. But the second one, Daly was in front of me, and Daly was wearing a white shirt, and personally I thought they were trying to get, well, they may have been trying to get in, but they got John Egan through the chest. I shouted like to the lads just to encourage them to keep out a charge, that we weren't too far off them, you know. But immediately then, the priest comes down, Father Baker, and he had his hand up that, and he comes in between the two parties. Do you understand me? With his hands up. Father Baker. Well, we could do nothing then, only retire.
The officer whom you heard and whom I talked with in Dublin was in command of the magazine guard.
Round about midnight, the men did appear at the bottom of this steep slope leading up to the magazine and the headquarter buildings, and there was a certain amount of shouting and noise, and then they rushed forward, and some shots were fired, and most unfortunately, 2 men were killed. Father Baker rushed forward bravely and held up his hands and stopped them and persuaded them to go back and rest the night quiet.